in the complete opposite direction, we have social transhumanism. So transhumanism itself we'll talk about later, but as a short version now, it is the idea that priority in a government should be to exceed the capabilities of what humans are capable of, or in other things like biotech or robotics are the future of humanity. So social transhumanism is the idea that the best way to achieve that is through a socialist or shared wealth economy. So redistribute the money as much as possible so that we can make robot people. And that whole thing I talked about earlier, how if two things are near each other, it doesn't mean they're similar. Social transhumanism being right above the farmers co-op should be pretty good proof of that. And then above those two, we have conservative socialism, which this one's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a socialist economy with conservative or traditional values. The commonality between those two ideologies is, for one, you need a state to redistribute the wealth, and on the other side, you need a state to instill or maintain family values. So conservative socialism is having a state to make people continue life the way you want them to and make sure they share their money. Right above that, we have Chavism, which is the ideology of Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez. The basic ideas he put forward were of a very controlling or at least militaristic state, and the large amount of socialism or redistribution was primarily done as a means of increasing the military power. So Chavism is basically the idea of shared wealth as a means of maintaining one's own military capabilities. And then jumping down here for our first one on the left wall, we have Orthodox Marxism. Orthodox Marxism is kind of meta because it's the original idea of Marx. However, Orthodox Marxism was established after Marx died, so it's people trying to get back to the original way Marx used to be. So yeah, but it's basically the idea that the only way forward for a nation is to have a completely classless society, or in other words, everyone is completely equal when it comes to decision making and wealth. This also puts the control of state affairs directly into the people's hands and works as a sort of insisted equality. And then right above that, we have Trotskyism, which suitably is the ideology of Leon Trotsky. The best way to describe Trotskyism, or at least in my completely uneducated opinion, is it's orthodox Marxism with government action put into it. And I use the term government loosely. Basically, a small group of people who have the capability to cause a revolution that will eventually lead to orthodox Marxism. We're going to talk about more in a second, but it's basically the idea that a small group of people can act like the state for a while in order to get the people to a place in which they can live in a more socialist perspective, to which they can then step back and achieve orthodox Marxism. It's sort of an ends justify the means approach to government. And then right above that, we have Leninism. Leninism essentially operated as the prelude to communism, and whereas orthodox Marxism is the idea everyone should be equal, Trotskyism is the idea that you can push a little bit in order to get to a place where everyone can be equal. Leninism is an active step-by-step guide of how to achieve that. Basically, it focuses on something known as the Vanguard Party, which is the idea that a small group of leaders will step forward and be leaders for a while in order to throw out the old capitalist or bourgeoisie, which is a fancy way of saying the high up in charge, or upper class, or whatever, you get the point, and then hand control back over to the people. As mentioned, Leninism is a much more active or direct action form than the two that I mentioned previously, and in practice is very anti-capitalist, and by that I mean if there are businesses or people that are maintaining a wealth or class status above other people, then Leninism gets rid of them either by throwing them out of the country or throwing them out of existence. Also, a core idea with Leninism, and this also kind of applies to Trotskyism, is the revolution has to be maintained in people's eyes forever. So essentially, you build up a bunch of energy in order to get them to a place in which they can achieve a socialist society, and then you keep the momentum going by saying that they're still fighting the fight. And that's why a lot of sort of leftist literature you read or leftist posters that you see encourage things like we're all together fighting the good fight, because it keeps up the idea that the fight's never over. So short version, maintaining a small group of the state for a while in order to get rid of the bad people, and then create a new system in which people are more equal and there's a socialist society to which the state can then dissolve itself. And then coming back over here, we have monarcho-communism, which is another perfect example of that whole rule of average thing. So it's the idea of having a monarchy and a communist society at the same time. So it's the right-wing idea of divine right to rule and kings and queens and all that, mixed with the far left idea of a communist state. So in practice, you would have a born ruler who had the privilege to rule at birth or whatever, ruling or reigning over a group of people who are trying to maintain a classless society between themselves, but they have a king. So yeah. Also, and not a lot of people know this, one of the core tenets of communism is that the state eventually goes away. Basically, you have a very powerful state for a while to redistribute the funds and get the workers groups together, and then the state disappears. However, if you had that along with a monarchy and like a born lineage, does like the king leave eventually, or just like, does he just like kind of disappear into the air? Obviously, this is a high up ideology because it's ideas of communism and monarchism, but it comes out in the middle of the two basically, because it's very far left and very far right. And I'm pretty sure this is impossible, but if not, please explain to me how it's any different, because I legitimately would like to know. And then right above that, we have Baathism. So Baathism is a form of Arabian nationalism. So while it's very, very right-wing when it comes to their beliefs and practices, it also advocates for public ownership and a sort of unity between Arabs. And it also emphasizes a vanguard party or small group of elites who can flip over a government, like Leninism, only in Baathism they don't really go away. So it sort of comes out as a middle road, again because of averages, because it's very left when it comes to like economy and peoples, and very right when it comes to, you know, traditions and beliefs. And overall, very pro-government. And then just to the left of that, we have left-wing nationalism. Left-wing nationalism is pretty much the idea of having a socialist or communal society that you shut off and violently defend it from anyone who says otherwise. This would be the mindset of people like Che Guevara or the IRA. Essentially, it's a very pro-leftist government, and maybe even progressive with some of their beliefs, although Che was not progressive at all in his beliefs, but holds the stringent idea of leaving us alone within our socialist state, or will literally kill you. And then to the left of that, we have Mugabeism. This is named after Robert Mugabe, who was the leader of Zimbabwe. And while when it comes to the economy within the state, it's a very Marxist-Leninist ideology, what keeps it from being all the way left is Mugabe was sort of a black nationalist and very violent against outsiders to the region, and is most known for the authoritarian military regime, which is the reason due to social politics he's over to the left, and due to the overwhelming government policies way up north. Right above that, we have Xiism. This is in reference to the modern leader of China, so that should say enough. Holds ideas of a socialist state as well as the government always being correct. So full censorship, full putting away of personal agency, and the government's always right. Just don't question it. If you question it, you get shot. Just trust me. Nothing happened at Tiananmen Square. Why are you asking? Left of both of those, we have anti-revisionism. This is an idea that cropped up after Stalin lost power and Khrushchev came to power. Or I should say Stalin died, but he still lost power, so I'm still right. And it's basically the idea that Russia was ran the correct way under Stalin, and new people who want to back off of his principles need to stop. Or essentially, it's people who had the communist ideal and then didn't like the way that the country was going because of it. So they pretty much said, actually, let's let the state stick around and never dissolve it. And then for our first leftist ideology that touches the roof, we have eco-fascism. Now, this is still fascism that I talked about on the right quadrant, which is the ideas of nationalism and the people preserving what they have, but it's specifically applied to nature. So since that's sort of a leftist ideology, this one pretty much comes out on the center. And it's pretty much the idea of having a totalitarian state whose overall purpose is to do what's best for nature and make sure other people don't do something against it. To the left of that, we have Juche, which is the form of government in North Korea. And that explains why it's on the top. Pretty much 100% control of the normal people's lives is controlled by the government. And while there's a sense in equality in the fact that everyone's poor, there's a very clear ruling class that distributes money to the quote-unquote working class. So I mean, technically it's left, kind of, sort of. It's more pro-government than anything, though. To the left of that is something known as Strasserism. Strasserism was developed by the Strasser brothers right before Nazi Germany in World War II, and it's pretty much Nazism, and then add in the fact that no one can own anything and there's no private businesses. So it's a full form of socialism controlled by the state, within what would have been Nazi Germany. So keep all the racist principles and the genocides and all that, and also no one can own anything, and it's fully public markets, basically. And then to the left of that, there's Maoism, named after Chairman Mao of China. So in theory, Maoism is Leninism, only those vanguard people I talked about have to be commoners, or basically rather than getting a few people to lead everyone leads themselves. However, in practice, there is a ton of authority worship. Like, people saw Chairman Mao as essentially some form of God that couldn't be touched. So because of that, whenever he enacted something, they weren't one to question the will of God. Which is the reason while his things like the Great Leap Forward ended up killing about 55 million people through a famine, but ideas that we see other places up here of the government always being right, Mao was kind of the forerunner of. And then to the left of that is National Bolshevism, also known as Red Fascism. It's pretty much fascism, only full communist when it comes to economy and workers' markets. So keep all the racism, keep all the nationalism and all that stuff, and then they want a full communist government, only this.
3, 2, 1, go!
Time to take up the
The state never dissolves. So imagine like a really, really racist China. I am simplifying it a bit, but it's extreme ideas of nationalism combined with a permanent communist regime. And then finally, in the top left corner, we have Stalinism, which is, of course, the ideas of Joseph Stalin during and after World War II. So remember how, like, when it comes to Leninism and communism, the idea is the state exists for a while, or the vanguard party or whatever exists for a while in order to get to a classless society, and then they leave. So imagine all of the drive and power needed to achieve that, and then they never intended to leave at all, not one bit. Stalin came to power and had anyone who disagreed with him executed or thrown in prison. In one of history's most extreme cases of totalitarianism, he ended up killing about 48 million people through his decisions when it came to famines and who was to be executed and etc. And it is probably one of the most extreme examples in history of someone getting all the power and then doing everything wrong with it. But at least like when Mao had the Great Leap Forward, it was to convert the country from a rural industry into like a tech and, you know, like city urban industry. It didn't work and was a horrible idea and killed potentially more people than Stalin, but at least he had a point. Stalin just didn't like people and had him killed. I remember in one story about Stalin, according, and I'm not sure the validity of this, it could have been disproven, but it kind of fits. Whenever he was on his deathbed, he was asleep for a few days, and then I believe it was his daughter watched him as he woke up, looked at the ceiling, shook his fist at the sky, and died. And fighting God is the appropriate way to describe everything that man ever did. And now we are on to the bonus wacky off the compass ideologies. Starting down here on the left with communalism. Communalism is most easily described as, remember the Confederacy thing I talked about earlier, and how it's a loosely strung together group of independent nations or independent states? Well, imagine that, only instead of states, it's like farms and private groups of people. So in other words, you have these small communities that share everything with each other, and they share with other communities, and it's a big kumbaya sharing circle. Alright, so this is one of my favorite wacky ideologies on the whole thing. Socialism. So you know how like with like Lenin and theoretically with Mao and stuff, the whole idea is you need a powerful state in order to get to communist or socialist ideas. Well, Socialism also wants to get to socialist ideas, but it says the only way to do that is through a nuke, and I'm not kidding. The idea with Socialism is that the only way we can achieve a truly leftist world is to nuke the pre-existing one because it's too tainted. And then from the ashes of that, in a very Fallout-esque fashion, we can rebuild a truly classless leftist society. There's like at least 3 people out there that unironically subscribe to that. This next one is too long to spell out on the board. However, it stands for Fully Automated Luxury Space Gay Communism, which is a parody of all the leftist ideas of people being taken care of and being classless and progressive and whatever. It's we all go to space and we're all gay and we're communists. So yeah. And then off the top left corner of the compass, we have hive mind collectivism, which if you've ever heard